Since Never Say Never Again isn't considered one of the official Bond films, I'm approaching this review as a standalone episode, and not part of my Shaken Not Stirred series. That's an interesting notion. An unofficial Bond film based off of an existing Ian Fleming novel and starring Sean Connery, no less. So why is it always missing from the boxed sets? Why is its entry in the franchise considered so taboo and often ignored, especially now that MGM owns the distribution rights? I've covered the story briefly in my Thunderball review, but admittedly, at the time I hadn't actually seen Never Say Never Again. When it first came out in 1983, it actually got a lot of praise, and I attribute a lot of that to the fact that Connery came back to the role after being absent from the series for 12 years. Today, it's not that uncommon to see action heroes come out of retirement, but this was a unique case. It was the first and only time that two Bond films competed with each other. On top of Never Say Never Again, Roger Moore's Octopussy opened earlier that year, so I can see why there was a lot of curiosity and anticipation for this film. So if this movie garnered critical acclaim and stars the actor who originally kicked off the franchise in the 60s, why is it usually cast aside to make way for the other 23 films? It started in the 60s. Ian Fleming was trying to produce his own film version of James Bond called Longitude 78 West, which he was co-writing with an independent producer named Kevin McClory. The project fell through because of an escalating budget, but Fleming interjected a lot of the script into his next James Bond novel, Thunderball, which inevitably became its own film. However, problems arose when McClory pursued legal action against Fleming for not crediting him as co-writer of the novel. This led to a legal battle that lasted a very long time. Things were said, emotions and egos were blown sky high, and when the dust cleared, McClory somehow obtained some of the film rights, allowing him to go off and make his own Bond movie, but one only based off of Thunderball because that was the one he supposedly worked on with Fleming. He also secured rights to the character of Ernst Blofeld, which is why after the Sean Connery era ended, we stopped seeing him as a major villain. We got better ones, like Jaws. One of the reasons I took so long to watch the film, let alone review it, was because it's a remake of Thunderball, and I'm leery of remakes, especially in this day and age where remakes make up the majority of the box office. But as I've said before, after a while, the stories in the Bond films seem to get recycled. After 23 films, you're bound to run out of steam somewhere. From the film's opening sequence, it's obvious how this one stands apart from the rest of the Eon films. There's no traditional gun barrel opening, and not even a title sequence. Instead, we get a screen with the 007 logo spewed all over it, and then we're thrown right into the film, with the title song being played over the action. It's very surreal, especially if you're used to the traditional opening sequences of the past films. We're reintroduced to Sean Connery, back as the aging 00 agent. That's an interesting theme in this film. The filmmakers actually acknowledged his age, he was 52 at the time, and implemented that into the story. It wasn't like they were trying to recapture Connery's glory days. Even though it's an adaptation of Thunderball, this film takes place in Bond's later years. MI6 has all but disbanded the 00 agents, and Q Branch actually has a reduced budget. It's only after the world is once again threatened by Spectre that M calls the 00s back on assignment. So we find Connery, complete with wrinkles and gray hair, on a routine training mission. Notice how when he fires the gun there's no muzzle blast. They couldn't do a simple animation effect? Back at MI6, Bond gets reunited with Miss Moneypenny, although it's kind of discouraging not to see him together with Lois Maxwell, who is still playing the character with Roger Moore in the Eon series. We also have a reunion with Spectre leader Ernst Blofeld, who is about as threatening as Dr. Evil. In the earlier films, even though Blofeld stayed in the shadows, he was a fairly ominous presence. All we had to see was the back of his head and his hand stroking that cat, and we knew he was a threat somehow. This film leaves no mystery as to who the character is. They introduce him pretty casually. To make matters worse, he's played by Max von Sydow. I guess he didn't have an exorcism to attend that weekend. It's just such an off-kilter casting choice. For someone who bragged that he had exclusive film rights to Blofeld, he sure didn't take advantage of it. Because Bond failed in his training mission, M sends him to a clinic to get a physical. While there, he seduces two of the orderlies, and then gets attacked by this guy, who looks like he might be in the running as a Ghostbuster. Aside from this guy's super strength, he keeps picking on this little knick-knack look-alike. But you see how strong and menacing this guy is? It brings me back to the days of Oddjob and Red Grant, which really isn't a bad thing. Eventually, Bond gets debriefed by... Is that Rowan Atkinson? In a Bond movie? I guess it's not that out of the ordinary, given that Atkinson would later star in his own spoof, Johnny English. But if you're familiar with his Mr. Bean character, just seeing him make an appearance in a Bond movie is irregular. He gets seduced by a Spectre operative, Fatima Blush, aboard a yacht. This has got to be one of the strangest, out-of-place love scenes I've ever seen. Is the boat really moving that much? It doesn't look like they're exactly riding on rough waters. Then the whole screen tips, and before we know it, they're in the ocean. Did the transition just throw them overboard? Of course, Blush sets up a trap where Bond gets pursued by sharks, in a scene mirroring that of Thunderballs. The setup is different, but the suspense works well. But will someone tell me why in the next scene he's dressed like Buford? Bond rendezvous with Felix Leiter, who is being played by the first African-American to don the role, Bernie Casey, who would later go on to play a minor role as the teacher, Mr. Ryan, in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. The only problem I have with this is the lack of consistency, since in every Bond movie before, Leiter is Caucasian. This quickly gets debunked because the character is always played by a different actor. Sometimes he's young, sometimes he's old, and sometimes he's black. You could also make the argument that since this film exists outside the canon of the Eon films, it really doesn't matter. The story is that Connery suggested Casey so that audiences would remember the character. After all, in all the preceding films, Leiter was pretty much a one-note plot thread.
Get me making a white pimpmobile.
He is here, too. Keep in mind, this has nothing to do with race. It doesn't matter what ethnic background the character comes from. If anything, the series is overpopulated with aging British white guys. But if actors like Desmond Llewellyn, Lois Maxwell, and Bernard Lee can make return visits to their characters, why was Felix Leiter so hard to lock down? And why is there so much discrepancy with his character on film? He plays such a small role in these movies that it's almost not worth it to include him in the story. Needless to say, Eon finally took a few notes from this movie, as another African-American actor, Jeffrey Wright, would portray Felix in the Daniel Craig films. We're introduced to Largo's mistress, Domino, played by a very young, pre-Batman Kim Basinger, who doesn't seem to age. Look at her now compared to, say, her appearance in 2002's 8 Mile. You have to admit, most women only dream they could age that well. The same can't be said for Mr. Connery, who makes his move by posing as a masseuse. This is really creepy. Grandpa's fondling the babysitter. Seriously, there's nothing charming about this scene unless you like retired heroes robbing the cradle. Even if he's Sean Connery, this whole romance is unsettling.
It's disgraceful. You're old enough to be her grandfather.
So James shows up to Largo's party where we get reacquainted with Miss Blush, who shows up wearing an outfit very reminiscent of the one Xenia Onatopp wore in GoldenEye. Bond finally meets Largo where they have a face-off with a video game. This is a nice change from the usual card game, and it's interesting to note that they used this scenario. Consider the time period. This was around the time of the video game boom, right before the infamous crash. It made sense that the filmmakers would capitalize on it. As you'd expect, the game is rigged to deliver an intense electric shock to the opponent each time the opposing player scores a hit. And of course, it's a game where each side launches nukes against the other. If Spectre were to ever change its business tactics and become an evil video game manufacturer instead of a crime syndicate, I'd imagine that would be the best type of game to suit them. Although Bond loses a couple of rounds, he makes a glorious, although unexplained, comeback. I love Largo's expression when he loses. It's as if he can't actually feel the electricity running through his body. During a dance number, Bond reveals, similar to in Thunderball, how it was Largo who had Domino's brother killed. There's a pretty impressive bike chase for an 80s action movie that is actually reminiscent of some of the Roger Moore films, and for a few minutes anyway, makes you forget about Connery's age. He chases Blush through the streets until she corners him, wearing whatever this little gypsy getup is. She forces Bond to write a note confessing his undying loyalty to her before she kills him, but Bond, equipped with a Q-branch pen, fires. This is arguably the best death in the film. But wait a minute. A very similar weapon existed in GoldenEye. It sounds like someone got very jealous of this film and used a few ideas down the road, namely Blush's earlier black outfit and the exploding pen.
Were you expecting an exploding pen? We don't really go in for that anymore.
This next scene is hilarious. I'm skipping ahead a little, but ultimately Largo discovers Bond's plans and kidnaps Domino, tying her up and leaving her for a clan of gypsies. Bond disguises himself as one of them, comes to her rescue on horseback, and evades the bad guys by jumping from the top of the castle. First, this weird close-up shot is awkward, and we're not expecting it. Second, the effect of James, Domino, and the horse falling to their doom is a sad staple of 80s effects work. It's cheap and hard to take seriously. Remember, the same guy who directed this made The Empire Strikes Back, and a lot of the same crew members from Empire worked on this, so what the hell happened? If you've seen Thunderball, you pretty much know what to expect next. There's a big underwater fight where Bond disarms the missile and kills Largo. Then, of course, he winds up with the very beautiful, very youthful Kim Basinger. Again, it's creepy, and if you're a fan of Basinger, this will serve only to piss you off. It's like today if Scarlett Johansson ended up in bed with Harrison Ford in the next Indiana Jones movie. You know what? In this sick industry, I wouldn't put it past them. especially since Lucasfilm is now owned by Disney. So that's Never Say Never Again. Not bad, but really nothing memorable. Honestly, the only thing that could have saved it from being a forgotten relic was a series of these retirement-style films where Connery kept coming back as Bond. Wouldn't it have been interesting to see 2 series featuring the same character competing neck and neck? After filming Diamonds Are Forever, Connery was quoted as saying he would never again play James Bond, which is where the title comes in. This was a precursor to what's been going on in action films today. In the last 7 years, we've seen the return of Indiana Jones, John McClane, John Rambo, and Rocky Balboa, not to mention many action stars of the 80s and 90s making comebacks in alternative roles, such as Arnold Schwarzenegger. Usually the result is less than praiseworthy, but all of these comeback films are testaments to what audiences back then thought about them. In a world of featureless remakes, I'd much rather see subpar sequels. If you haven't checked it out, I'd recommend it for curiosity's sake, although honestly, I think Thunderball was technically the better film. Still, after having to get used to Roger Moore, this one's a breath of fresh air and probably emerged at just the right time. It made the public remember Sean Connery as the classic 00 agent, even if it was for a short time.